It was 1982, and Times Beach looked like the American dream in miniature, a small town of 2,000 residents on the banks of the Merrimack River, Missouri, where everyone knew each other by name. Children played on dirt roads, horses grazed on family farms, and life moved at the quiet pace of rural America. Marilyn Leistner was 45 years old, a housewife, mother of 3, and never imagined she would become one of the most important women in American environmental history. She woke up every morning, made coffee, sent the kids to school, and took care of the modest home where she had lived with her husband for 20 years. But something was wrong in Times Beach. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, strange signs began to appear. At the Piat farm, robust horses that had always been healthy began dying without explanation. First it was Star, a brown mare who had given birth to dozens of foals. Then Beauty, a stallion who had never been sick. Within weeks, 14 horses died in agony, vomiting blood and convulsing until their last breath. Neighborhood children developed strange skin rashes, wounds that wouldn't heal, unexplained itching, red spots that appeared out of nowhere. Parents took their children to the doctor, but no one could explain what was happening. And there was the smell, an acrid chemical odor that hung in the air on certain days, especially when the wind blew from a specific direction. People talked among themselves, but no one knew where it came from or what it meant. It was on a September afternoon that Marilyn's life changed forever. She was talking to Judy Piat, owner of the farm where the horses had died, when she discovered something disturbing. "Marilyn," said Judy, tears in her eyes, "do you remember that man who came to spread oil on our road? Russell Bliss." Marilyn remembered. Russell Bliss was a local trucker who had been hired by the city to spread used oil on dirt roads to control dust. It was a common practice in small towns, cheap oil that kept roads in reasonable condition. "Well," Judy continued, "I found out he spread that oil here on the farm 3 months before the horses started dying." Something clicked in Marilyn's mind. She began connecting dots that had previously seemed isolated. The chemical smell, the children's illnesses, the animal deaths. Everything started after Russell Bliss spread that oil. That same week, Marilyn did something that would change her life. She decided to investigate. She started by asking neighbors. She discovered that several families had noticed the same pattern. Pets dying, children getting sick, plants wilting without explanation, and always after Bliss had passed with his oil truck. But when Marilyn tried to speak with local authorities, she met resistance. The mayor said she was seeing things where there was nothing. The town doctor suggested it was coincidence. The police chief said she was causing unnecessary panic. But Marilyn didn't give up. She was a determined woman, and the more resistance she encountered, the more convinced she became that something was being hidden. Marilyn decided to go straight to the source. She found Russell Bliss at a local bar and confronted him directly. "Russell," she said, sitting next to him at the counter, "I need to know what was in that oil you spread on our roads." Russell, a simple 50-year-old man, seemed genuinely confused. "It was just used oil, Marilyn. Same thing I always used." "But where did this oil come from?" Russell hesitated. "Well, a guy from St. Louis paid me to dispose of some waste. Said it was just motor oil mixed with some chemicals. Paid real well." "What guy from St. Louis?" "Worked for a company, Syntex, I think, or something like that." Marilyn felt her heart race. Syntex Corporation was a major chemical company. Why would a chemical company be paying to dispose of waste in a small town like Times Beach? Over the following days, Marilyn dove into an investigation that would consume her life for the next months. She called Syntex, but was transferred from department to department until they finally hung up on her. She went to the St. Louis Library and researched everything about the company. What she discovered terrified her. Syntex Corporation produced herbicides and pesticides, including a product called Agent Orange that had been used in the Vietnam War. During the production process, they generated toxic waste that needed to be disposed of, and apparently they were paying truckers like Russell Bliss to dispose of this waste illegally. But the worst was yet to come. In October 1982, Marilyn made contact with an investigative journalist from St. Louis who had covered industrial pollution cases. He became interested in the story and decided to help her. Together, they discovered that the waste Russell Bliss had spread in Times Beach wasn't just used oil. It was highly toxic byproducts from herbicide production, contaminated with a substance called dioxin. Dioxin is one of the most toxic substances known to mankind. It's carcinogenic, causes birth defects, destroys the immune system, and can kill in extremely small doses. A drop the size of a pinhead can contaminate an area the size of a football field. And Russell Bliss had spread thousands of gallons of these contaminated wastes on the roads of Times Beach. The journalist managed to have soil samples tested at independent laboratories. The results were devastating. Dioxin levels 100 times above what was considered safe. Some areas had concentrations so high they were lethal just from skin contact, but when they tried to publish the story, they faced immense pressure. Syntex Corporation hired powerful lawyers. Government officials began receiving threatening phone calls. Someone tried to bribe the journalist to abandon the investigation. Marilyn realized she had stumbled onto something much bigger than she had imagined. It wasn't just about a company illegally disposing of waste. It was about an entire system of corruption that allowed large corporations to poison entire communities to save money. For months, Marilyn became an obsessed woman. She organized meetings at the local church, confronted politicians, called government agencies, and did everything in her power to force authorities to act. But at every step, she faced resistance. Government officials denied knowledge of the problem. Syntex Corporation hired a public relations firm to spread misinformation, suggesting that Marilyn was a radical activist trying to harm local businesses. They investigated her personal life, looking for anything they could use against her. They spread rumors that she was mentally unstable. Some neighbors began avoiding her, worried that her crusade might hurt their property values. But Marilyn didn't give up. She knew lives were at stake. In November 1982, she finally managed to get national attention. An investigative television program decided to cover the story. TV cameras arrived in Times Beach, interviewed residents, filmed the dead horses, and tested the soil live on air. The results were shocking, even to the journalists themselves. Times Beach wasn't just contaminated, it was one of the most toxic sites in the United States. On December 23, 1982, 2 days before Christmas, federal government officials arrived in Times Beach with news that no one was prepared to hear. "This entire town must be evacuated immediately," announced the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, representative. "Dioxin levels are so high they pose a deadly risk to human health." Marilyn was at the town meeting when the announcement was made. She watched neighbors go into shock, mothers crying, fathers asking where they would take their families, confused children not understanding why they had to leave their homes. "You have until the end of January to evacuate," the official continued. "The government will buy all properties at market value, but no one can live here anymore. This town will cease to exist." In the following days, Times Beach transformed into an emotional war zone. Families packed decades of memories into boxes. Neighbors said goodbye, not knowing if they would see each other again. Businesses closed forever. Marilyn walked through the empty streets, seeing abandoned houses and gardens that would never bloom again. She had fought to save her town, but the price of truth was the town itself. In 1985, Times Beach was officially dissolved as a municipality. Houses were demolished, streets were covered with clean soil. The site became Route 66 State Park, a park where thousands of visitors pass every year without knowing about the tragedy that happened there. Marilyn moved to a neighboring town, but never stopped fighting. She became an environmental activist, helping other communities face similar problems. She testified in Congress. She inspired stricter environmental laws. Syntex Corporation paid millions in settlements, but never admitted guilt. Russell Bliss was also sued, but he was just a pawn in a much larger game. And Marilyn discovered something terrifying. Times Beach wasn't a unique case. Over the years, she received letters from people in other towns telling similar stories. Chemical companies illegally disposing of waste, communities being poisoned, authorities turning a blind eye. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of other Times Beaches scattered across the country. Towns that large corporations hoped would be forgotten. Families who suffered in silence to protect corporate profits. But Marilyn Leisner proved that an ordinary person can make a difference. A housewife from Missouri faced some of the most powerful corporations in the world, and won. She may not have saved Times Beach, but she saved countless lives and created a precedent that still protects American communities today. This is just the first story from Marilyn's files. There are many more hidden truths waiting to be exposed.